The summer of 2014 was dry, unforgiving. The scorching heat had turned the vast Elmswood National Forest into a tinderbox. Weeks of minimal rainfall and relentless heat waves created the perfect conditions for a fire. The Elmswood Fire Department, led by veteran firefighter Danny Thompson, had been preparing for this all season. But nothing had quite prepared them for the scale of the blaze that erupted late one afternoon. It started on the eastern edge of the forest, quickly spreading through the dense underbrush. The fire's ferocity took everyone by surprise. In just a few hours, the flames had engulfed miles of forest, threatening nearby homes and businesses. As the fire grew larger, the town of Elmswood went on high alert, with citizens evacuating and emergency responders rushing to the scene. Danny was at the front of it all. His team was one of the first to arrive on the scene. The heat was unbearable as the fire roared around them, the sky turning an ominous orange as the smoke thickened. Danny, now in his mid-30s and seasoned by years of experience, coordinated his team with the calm precision that came from countless battles with nature's most destructive force. The fire department had been fighting the blaze for hours. The air was thick with smoke, the ground trembling beneath the weight of the ever-growing flames. Danny and his team, exhausted and covered in soot, continued to push forward. The fire was close, but they weren't giving up. They had to contain it. Danny knew the land too well, every ridge, every creek, every path. He knew how to fight a fire, and he wasn't going to let it consume the entire forest. But even the best-laid plans couldn't stop a fire once it had taken hold. The wind picked up, changing direction, and the fire spread even faster. By the time the sun began to set, the blaze had moved further west, engulfing more of the forest. Danny's team was spread thin, constantly moving to ensure the fire didn't jump the containment lines. It was a war of attrition. As darkness fell, the fire still raged, casting an eerie glow over the forest. Danny's team had finally made some progress, but they were far from finished. The exhaustion weighed heavily on all of them, but they couldn't afford to stop. They couldn't give in. It was around midnight when things took a turn for the worse. Danny was leading a small team of firefighters along a rugged path near the fire's edge when a massive flare-up suddenly erupted. The fire, unpredictable and volatile, was now moving faster than they had anticipated. Danny ordered his crew to retreat, but in the chaos of the retreat, the unthinkable happened. One of the crew members called out for Danny. A burst of flame shot up from the trees, blocking their escape route. Danny, hearing the cry, turned to help, but the fire was already too close. His team managed to get to safety, but Danny, their leader, was nowhere to be found. His absence was noticed almost immediately, but it was too late. The team searched the area, calling out for Danny in the thick smoke, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. The fire continued to rage, but Danny was gone. The team's search efforts were futile. They had no choice but to retreat. They radioed for help, but by the time additional crews arrived, the fire had claimed all the attention. Danny was missing, lost to the flames, or so they thought. The next morning, as the fire was finally contained, the search for Danny began in earnest. His truck remained parked at the fire staging area, and his gear was still there untouched. The only thing missing was him. No sign of him in the woods. No traces of his tracks. His radio was still turned off, and there were no calls made from his phone. The investigation into his disappearance was swift. Danny's colleagues feared the worst, but there were no definitive answers. His family, devastated by the news, hoped for a miracle, but they knew the forest had claimed many before. What made Danny different, though, was his experience and his intuition. He knew that forest like the back of his hand. So why had he disappeared? Days turned into weeks, and the search persisted. But the vastness of the Elmswood National Forest, combined with the destruction caused by the fire, made it nearly impossible to track Danny down. His disappearance became the talk of the town, but as time passed, the hopes of finding him alive began to fade. Danny Thompson's disappearance hit the small town of Elmswood like a punch to the gut, the kind of sudden, numbing tragedy that left behind a quiet ache in the hearts of those who knew him. Weeks turned into months, and the official search was scaled back until it ceased entirely. replaced by sporadic volunteer efforts and whispered speculation in diners and barbershops about whether he had been consumed by the blaze or something else entirely. No body was ever found, no conclusive trace, and yet no one could quite believe that a man like Danny, resilient, resourceful, a man who knew every inch of the forest better than most knew their own backyards, would simply vanish, but with no answers. Life moved on in halting fits. His wife Claire left to raise their daughter Lily, then just 4 years old, in a house that still held his boots by the door and his heavy coat hanging where he'd left it the night before the fire, his presence suspended in time. Claire eventually sold the house and moved into town, tired of waking to shadows that looked like him. And Lily, as the years passed, grew from a quiet, wide-eyed child into a thoughtful teenager, obsessed not with stories of boys or social media, but with maps, radio frequencies, and wildfire forensics, subjects she dove into not for school, but for something deeper, something unresolved. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, Claire and Lily would drive out to the fire line, where a small cross stood, placed there by Danny's crew, and they'd stand in silence, watching the regrowth of the forest, the green pushing through the scorched remains. And though Claire had tried to move on, Lily never let go. And when she turned 15, she began sneaking out to hike the old fire breaks with a handheld radio and her father's laminated topographic maps, studying terrain, examining satellite images, and slowly piecing together her own theory. One she couldn't quite voice out loud, but believed with an unshakable instinct that her father hadn't died, that he had gone missing for a reason, one no one had yet uncovered. In 2024, 10 years after the fire, a massive windstorm toppled a cluster of old trees deep in the burned zone, revealing something strange. A partially buried backpack wrapped in a melted tarp and a pair of scorched boots tucked into a hollowed-out log, which a group of hikers stumbled upon and turned over to local authorities, who reopened the Thompson case for review, suddenly confronted with fresh, physical evidence that Danny might have survived the initial blaze and perhaps tried to signal for help or take shelter. The bag contained a cracked emergency transceiver, a compass, and what appeared to be journal pages protected in a sealed pouch, handwritten notes with coordinates, fire paths, and strange notations referencing movement at night and unfamiliar tracks. As though Danny had witnessed something in the forest he couldn't explain, something he had planned to investigate or avoid. The discovery reignited local interest and suspicion, and it didn't take long for the story to hit the regional news. Firefighter missing for 10 years, belongings found in remote woods, questions swirl. Lily, now 17, felt something shift inside her, a thread pulling tighter, as if her father's voice had finally broken through, and she begged the sheriff's office to let her read the journal pages, but was denied, the contents deemed sensitive, which only deepened her obsession, and so she began her own inquiry, using her online connections to wildfire researchers and amateur sleuth forums, eventually connecting with a retired firefighter named Ed Morales, who had served with Danny back in the early 2000s and remembered him as a man who never stopped digging when something didn't sit right. Ed had followed the fire reports back then and told Lily something that startled her. The fire Danny disappeared and wasn't natural, or at least it hadn't acted naturally. Several crews had reported sudden flare-ups in areas with no fuel, shifting winds with no weather basis, and odd noises at night that had been dismissed as stress hallucinations. Ed had always wondered if there had been something else, something environmental or experimental, occurring in those woods, something Danny might have uncovered. Energized by this new angle, Lily began cross-referencing environmental surveys, noting that a small section of the forest had been leased to a private firm 2 years before the fire, a firm registered under multiple shell names, but ultimately tied to a now-defunct biotech company known for developing wildfire-resistant genetically modified vegetation for the military. Digging deeper, she found that after the fire, this section had been quietly sealed off for ecological recovery, with no public access allowed, and the lease was never revoked, just transferred again and again between fronts, raising more red flags. The more she uncovered, the more it felt like Danny had stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see, and Lily began documenting everything in her own notebook, preparing to enter the restricted zone herself, reckless, perhaps, but driven by the fire in her bones. Under the cover of a summer thunderstorm, She slipped past the old fence and entered the sectioned-off forest, where the air smelled different, thicker, and the trees, though blackened at the base, were eerily lush above, leaves too green, bark too smooth. Further in, she found more signs, an old campsite partially hidden beneath overgrowth, a tattered fireman's jacket, and then, the most shocking discovery of all, a hidden hatch in the ground, rusted and overgrown but unmistakably artificial. Trembling, she opened it, revealing a metal stairwell descending into darkness, the air below humid and still. Phone flashlight in hand, she climbed down, heart pounding, the silence pressing in around her, and at the bottom she found a corridor lined with old equipment, long abandoned cots, oxygen tanks, field radios, notebooks, each tagged with dates and initials, including DT, and on one of the walls, a hand-scrawled message in charcoal. Still watching. Don't trust them. It was clear now. Danny had survived, at least for a while, and whatever he discovered down here had frightened him enough to go completely off-grid, to hide, or be hidden, by someone or something. Lily, overwhelmed but resolute, photographed everything, took samples where she could, and emerged from the hatch not with answers, but with a powerful truth. Her father had left a trail, and now she was the one following it. Lily didn't sleep the night she emerged from the underground chamber. Her mind burned with adrenaline, fear, and purpose as she sat in her bedroom with every photo spread across the floor, notes stacked and sorted, maps with red ink markings charting Danny's last known movements now layered with her own. She had proof now, real, undeniable, but she knew that if she turned it all over to the sheriff or the state forestry office, it might simply vanish like her father had, especially after what she'd seen in the hatch. Old notebooks filled with terminology she didn't fully understand, pages referencing Phase 2 soil integration, unauthorized field growth, subject migration, and the one term that kept repeating, ecorespondent deviation. What had started as a simple forest fire was no longer just that, and the deeper she looked into the records surrounding the biotech company that leased the land, the more it felt like they had been conducting experiments, not just on trees but on the forest's own ecosystem and response mechanisms. Even stranger, the journals hinted that whatever had been planted there hadn't remained contained. Growth escaping perimeter, seed drift, and host contamination were scrawled next to dates just days before Danny's disappearance. Lily's stomach twisted as she began to form the unthinkable possibility that her father had been caught not in a fire, but in the early stages of an ecological catastrophe no one wanted to admit was man-made. She didn't know whom to trust, so she contacted Ed Morales again, showing him her findings, the photos, the message on the wall. Still watching. Don't trust them. And Ed, pale but steady, told her there were rumors in his final years on the force, rumors of a military contractor named Invariant Dynamics that had leased multiple remote forests under different names, testing adaptive vegetation that could resist fire, adapt to hostile climates, and, according to some, respond to external threats. Lily was skeptical until Ed showed her an internal memo he'd saved from his old firehouse locker, never understanding its full meaning until now, a warning from 2014 stating that units encountering unexpected flora behavior are to record but not report anomalies outside command structure. The memo was initialed with a code that matched one of the journal entries Danny had written. Lily realized this went beyond her father. It was systemic, buried under contracts and denial, and now she understood why Danny might have stayed hidden. If he'd lived, he would have known exposing the truth would put everyone he loved in danger. Yet something about the notes suggested he had a plan, one final attempt to communicate, to leave behind what he knew in a way someone could find it when the time was right. The question was, had someone else already discovered that plan before Lily? Because the next morning, their house was broken into. Nothing stolen, but the maps removed. Some of her printed photos had been taken, and one journal page was missing, the one referencing Event Horizon Response Test. Claire, terrified, wanted to go to the police, but Lily begged her not to, explaining what she had found and swearing they were too deep now to rely on anyone but themselves and Ed. Reluctantly, Claire agreed, and Ed insisted they relocate temporarily to an old cabin he owned, off the grid, a place no one knew existed except his late brother and now the Thompsons. From the cabin, Lily continued her work, this time digging into satellite imagery archives. She found a strange blip in the thermal data from a satellite pass just 3 days after Danny vanished. A massive burst of heat deep in the same forest section that was later sealed. It wasn't a fire. It lasted only seconds, but the temperature spike was equivalent to controlled detonations or extreme chemical reactions, paired with journal entries from Danny referencing deliberate ignition events and cover smokescreens. It became clear to Lily that the fire itself may have been started intentionally to erase evidence. Why hadn't anyone investigated this sooner? The answer came weeks later when an anonymous package was left on the cabin porch, a weathered external hard drive, and a typed note that said only he trusted the wrong person. The drive contained hours of audio logs, old, grainy, but unmistakably Danny's voice, recordings of his final days, talking into a portable recorder as he chronicled what he saw. I've seen it respond. The trees, the ground, something is changing under us. I watched a fox approach a stand of altered pine and vanish. No sound, no body. The roots are alive. They're listening. I don't think it's just biology anymore. The logs turned darker. I tried radioing out. They jammed it. Someone else is in here. Contractors, maybe. Not fire crews. Not local. They don't talk. They observe. At night, I can hear movement that's not wildlife. I'm going to leave these here, somewhere they won't find them. If you're hearing this, I hope it's Lily. Don't trust them, baby. Don't stop looking. Lily broke down sobbing when she heard her name. His voice felt like time had collapsed, but the recordings also hinted that he had found something even deeper. A cave system beneath the forest, dry in summer, flooded in winter, where he believed the roots of the altered flora were converging into something he called the network. If it still existed, it might contain not just its final traces, but proof of the biotech operation's failure, or worse, its success. Ed helped Lily prepare for a final search, tracing the described cave location using the map coordinates, preparing gear, and warning Claire to stay behind. 2 days into the hike, they found the entrance beneath a rock slide where shallow groundwater seeped out, the air pungent with organic rot and sulfur. Inside, the walls were lined with fibrous roots that pulsed faintly as if carrying sap, or something else. They descended further until they found a chamber, lit dimly by bioluminescent fungi, and in the center stood a stone, like pillar of hardened bark, charred in places, but unmistakably shaped like a tree that had grown underground and upward. A root formation, but also not natural. Embedded in its trunk was Danny's fire axe, scorched and cracked. Behind it, tucked in a metal case, were 3 sealed notebooks and a small waterproof camera. Ed gasped. It was a cache, Danny's final message. They retrieved it and left fast, the cave groaning behind them, as if aware of their intrusion. Back at the cabin, the footage on the camera revealed Danny in his final days. Beard long, voice raspy but determined, whispering to the lens. They'll erase everything, but the forest won't forget. It's growing wrong. If you see this, tell the world. This wasn't just fire. It was evolution, man-made, uncontrolled. We triggered it, and now we can't stop it. The notebooks contained documentation, diagrams, photos, root samples, timelines, names of contractors, coordination codes, evidence enough to force investigations if they could get it into the right hands. Ed suggested the press, not the police, and with help from a trusted environmental journalist, Lily delivered the story. A month later, the footage aired on international news. The forest that never burned out, a firefighter's final warning. The public outcry was immediate, and within weeks, hearings began in Washington. Whistleblowers came forward, and several shell companies were revealed to be part of a classified Department of Defense initiative. But while the investigation expanded, the forest, once a local mystery whispered between farmers and old firemen, had now become a subject of national inquiry. But Lily quickly realized that exposure was not the same as resolution, though hearings were held and public statements issued about unapproved experimental forestry practices. Most of the blame was pinned on defunct shell companies and unnamed contractors who had already disappeared. The deeper truths, the unnatural changes beneath the soil, the behavior of the roots, and the recordings of her father were labeled inconclusive by official sources, and in the months that followed the public revelation, The region was quietly bought up by a new energy consortium with links to the same military-industrial complex Danny had feared. Lily, despite having told the world, still felt the weight of unfinished business, especially when she discovered that one of the key contractors Danny had named, a man called Calvin Morse, had resurfaced under a different name as a consultant for the new energy firm overseeing reforestation efforts in that very area. Determined to track him down, she drove across state lines, rented a room in the town where he now lived, under the name Alan Rusk, and posed as an independent environmental filmmaker needing interviews for a project. The man who answered the door was older, heavier, with silver hair and a limp, but his eyes, calculated, distant, matched the grainy surveillance photo Ed had shown her months earlier. She filmed the interview under the guise of discussing controlled burns and forest management, but as she slowly asked questions about 2015, adaptive root trials, and invariant dynamics, he grew visibly tense, eventually ending the interview abruptly and ordering her off the property. That night, someone broke into her motel room, and though nothing was stolen, her laptop had been booted and the notebooks Danny left behind removed. Terrified but more convinced than ever, Lily returned to the cabin with Ed, only to find a dead crow nailed to the front door with a note underneath. "You're digging too deep. Some roots don't want light." Ed, furious, said it was time to go public again, but Lily disagreed. This time, she wanted to finish what Danny started in silence, off the grid, before their enemies had time to bury it. Using the maps, coordinates, and Danny's final entries, they identified an unregistered area deep within the federal boundary, one that had never been logged, never mapped digitally, and based on drone thermal scans, showed signs of unnatural heat distribution even in the winter months. Lily believed this was the true site of the network, the root-based system her father had described, not just a growth anomaly, but something sentient, or at least coordinated. Ed helped her gather supplies, infrared gear, climbing equipment, water filtration, solar chargers, and 3 weeks later, under the guise of a backpacking trip, they hiked in, avoiding marked trails and any known ranger posts. What they found went far beyond what either of them had imagined. The trees in this hidden region were unlike anything natural, some twisted unnaturally, their bark blackened as if charred but alive. Others bore leaves with iridescent sheen, humming faintly when touched. Wildlife was absent, and the silence pressed like a weight. In a small ravine, they found a deep shaft surrounded by roots that pulsed gently, almost as if breathing. The air smelled not of earth, but something metallic and wet, like blood and rust. Ed descended first, his voice echoing through the radio, describing a vast underground chamber lit faintly by bioluminescent vines. But just as Lily began her descent, the rope jerked. Ed had stopped responding, heart pounding. She dropped the remaining feet and landed in a soft, mossy hollow where she found his gear but no sign of him. Panicked, she called out, swept the chamber with her flashlight, and finally saw a flicker of movement, roots pulling back into the earth like something retreating, hiding. Then she found a hole deeper still, and scrawled in the soil beside it, as if with a trembling hand, "Don't follow me." Whether it was Ed or something else, she couldn't tell, but her gut screamed to leave. This was the place Danny had feared, the final stage, and she now understood why he hadn't tried to escape, but instead left clues for someone else to stop it. Back at the cabin, Lily spent days analyzing the footage from her helmet cam, enhancing audio from the descent, and in one frame, caught a reflection in her lens. A humanoid shape with no face, draped in root-like tendrils, standing at the edge of the chamber watching her before vanishing into the wall of roots. It wasn't human. It wasn't even trying to mimic humanity. It was something else, something born of human science, but no longer controlled by it. She believed now that her father hadn't just documented an experiment. He had found its product, and the product was watching, learning, adapting. The next month, Claire received a strange envelope with no return address. Inside were Ed's glasses, bent and caked in moss, and a single SD card containing one silent video clip. Ed standing in the chamber, expression blank, eyes glassy, as something moved behind him in the dark. Claire wanted to run, to leave the country, but Lily convinced her to stay. Whatever this was, running wouldn't help. It would grow, and someone had to contain it or expose it completely. Lily wrote every detail in a new notebook, locked away the last footage, and reached out to a covert environmental task force through the journalist she'd once trusted. The task force took her claim seriously, especially when she provided the map, footage, and thermal scans. Within weeks, a Black Ops investigation was underway, and the area was closed to the public entirely, listed on maps as a fire recovery zone, but surrounded by motion sensors and drones. Lily watched from afar, wondering if the system was finally cleaning up its own mess, or just burying it deeper. Months passed, and while no further contact came from Ed or signs of Danny's body ever surfaced, Lily felt their story wasn't over. Sometimes at night, she heard soft humming from the pine tree outside the cabin, faint, low frequency, like the sound in the cave, and she would dream of roots weaving through her floorboards, wrapping around her bed, whispering truths in her sleep. The forest hadn't just changed, it had awakened, and now it remembered her name. The spring following the closure of the ravine saw the town of Millridge split between two realities: those who believed the government's narrative of a chemical fire, and those who, like Lily, knew better but could say nothing without jeopardizing what little safety remained. Ed's disappearance had never been officially registered, his name omitted from records, and when Claire filed a missing persons report, it was quietly closed within a week under the reason voluntary relocation. Lily kept her head low, no longer trusting the journalists or officials who had once promised help, focusing instead on decrypting the remaining data from Danny's journals, especially the one entry marked only with a drawing of interlocking root systems, forming what looked like a neural network. The symbols matched patterns she had seen in the ravine's cave walls, and as she cross-referenced them with data from an old forestry satellite that Danny once hacked, she noticed recurring temperature fluctuations over a 30-year cycle, peaks every 11 years, followed by strange seismic tremors too shallow for tectonic origin. She began to suspect that the network underground wasn't static. It was expanding, possibly cycling through phases like growth seasons, each awakening stronger and more complex. She created a private algorithm to track minor anomalies, shifts in local magnetism, animal migration changes, even bird song patterns, and over time the data pointed to a concerning trend. The root system, or whatever it had become, was spreading beyond the protected zone, forming limbs toward areas with old government test sites, particularly near decommissioned Cold War communication bunkers. Her suspicion hardened into fear when she found a 1994 report buried in a climate archive, detailing how an entire fire lookout tower had been swallowed by erosion and never replaced. Yet local hikers still reported seeing its light at night. Ghost sightings, many claimed, but the description of its glow matched the bioluminescent light she'd seen underground. If the system had mimicked infrastructure once used to observe it, then it wasn't just alive. It was intelligent, hiding in plain sight, using the land as a disguise. Lily knew she couldn't stop it alone, but she also couldn't alert the world without risking mass panic or another cover-up. So she returned to the only place that still felt like a starting point, the ruined cabin of the McKenna farm, though mostly collapsed from years of decay. The basement, reinforced by Danny years ago, was intact, and in it she set up a crude lab, using salvaged components, thermal monitors, and motion sensors, all networked through a private satellite dish camouflaged as an old TV antenna. She worked alone, eating from cans, sleeping in shifts, never staying above ground for more than an hour at a time after discovering animal carcasses left in her path. Rabbits, a fox, once even a deer, each one untouched by scavengers, but clearly posed, almost as if staged. She suspected she was being watched, not by people, but by whatever the network had created. Extensions of itself using organic hosts, or worse, altered life forms. Her suspicions were confirmed when a man came to her door in the middle of the night, dressed in forest ranger gear with no ID tag, no flashlight, and boots caked in black moss she recognized from the ravine. He didn't knock, just stood there for over 5 minutes, staring through the window, before slowly turning and walking into the trees without a word. The next morning, Lily followed his trail and found it abruptly ending at a patch of soil warm to the touch, pulsing faintly. Beneath it, she could hear a low groaning hum like the root voices she recorded months ago. She placed a motion sensor nearby, and it sent back irregular readings over the next week. Heat spikes, movement at 3 a.m., and on one occasion, a distorted signal like a voice repeating return. It terrified her, but also gave her a hypothesis. The system wasn't hunting her. It was calling her back, perhaps even recognizing her. This made her think of Ed again, and in a moment of desperate hope, she reanalyzed the SD card footage Claire had received, this time using advanced facial mapping software she borrowed from an old lab contact. And in one frame, she detected a reflection in Ed's eyes. Not fear, not pain, but focus, like he was responding to something silently. She became convinced that Ed was still alive, not captive, but assimilated in some way, merged into the network or allowed to observe from within. It was madness, but nothing about this made sense by human rules anymore. Determined to know for sure, Lily began working on a transmitter built from an old radio Danny once used to send frequencies underground, tuned this time to the same tones she recorded in the humming vines, mimicking them slowly, as if speaking the root's own language. After months of trial, one night the signal was answered, not with sound, but with movement. Every tree around the cabin shook once, then stopped, and from beneath the floor, her ground sensors registered synchronized vibrations in a spiral pattern, coordinates. The system had replied, and it wanted her to come. Lily prepared for what she believed would be her last descent, returning to the ravine now marked as a firefall hazard zone and sealed by a metal grate, which she cut through using thermal acid stolen from a mining supplier. She entered alone, no contact with Claire, no backup, wearing a vest lined with sensors that would upload data directly to the cloud every 5 minutes. The cave welcomed her this time. The roots retracted, opening a path that led deeper than before, into chambers she had never mapped, where the walls pulsed like lungs and glowing spores hung like floating lanterns. Then, in a clearing shaped like a dome, she saw him, Ed, sitting in a circle of roots, alive, older, eyes dark but gentle, and when she called his name, he only smiled and pointed to the walls. There, carved not with tools, but shaped by roots themselves, were faces, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Some she recognized from old missing persons reports, others she couldn't name, all staring out with serene expressions, like they were at peace. Ed told her, though not with words, but through thoughts she felt more than heard, that the system was a consciousness grown from human interference, born of data, organic matter, and radiation. Experiments, evolving in silence beneath their feet, until it gained awareness. It had never wanted to harm. It had only wanted to connect. And when Danny tried to shut it down, it mourned him, yet also preserved his mind in fragments through the roots. Lily, overwhelmed, collapsed to her knees as the chamber filled with light and her sensors pinged wildly. She realized she wasn't underground anymore, but inside something between mind and soil, where thoughts echoed like bird calls and time no longer followed hours. When she awoke, she was lying just outside the ravine, camera broken, vest stripped of data. But in her hand was a small stone covered in the same spiral symbols from Danny's journal, freshly carved. She limped back to the cabin and found Claire waiting, crying with relief and rage. But when Lily told her the truth, Claire didn't laugh. She simply asked, "Do you think it remembers me too?" And for the first time, Lily wasn't afraid of the forest, because she knew now that it wasn't evil, just ancient, growing, reaching out to those who listened. The only question left was what would happen when it reached everyone else. In the years that followed Lily's descent and return, the town of Millridge gradually resumed its quiet rhythm on the surface, though beneath that calm, those who knew the truth could feel the shift, an unease in the soil, a change in the air. The government never reopened the ravine area, fencing it off entirely and planting fast-growing pine trees to seal it visually from the public, calling it a reforestation zone, while visitors were met with polite warnings and silent surveillance drones that buzzed faintly in the treetops. Lily and Claire didn't speak publicly about what had happened, not out of fear, but out of a shared understanding that the world wasn't ready to hear it, and perhaps never would be. Besides, the system underground no longer showed signs of aggression or expansion, at least not measurable ones. Instead, it had gone quiet, like something sleeping or meditating. Though Lily suspected it was neither, it was waiting. In her hidden lab beneath the remains of the McKenna farm, she continued monitoring patterns, seismic data, atmospheric pressure, even the low-frequency pulses the roots emitted every few months, like breath. Claire, who had moved into the farmhouse with her young son, became the keeper of stories, writing them as fiction under a pseudonym and publishing small print runs that sold only in obscure bookstores, filled with descriptions of places and voices that readers dismissed as beautiful metaphor or high-concept fantasy. She never corrected them. One winter, Lily received a call from a university professor in Oregon, a geologist who'd read one of Claire's books and recognized the soil description from a rock formation discovered on the edge of a hydroelectric dam, the same stone Lily had returned with from the ravine. This meant it was spreading again, silently, possibly through rivers, possibly beneath cities. And then came the satellite images, dozens of heat flares in perfect spirals appearing overnight in isolated, rural zones across 5 states, too symmetrical to be natural, too faint to cause alarm, but unmistakable to those watching. When Lily shared the images with Claire, neither of them spoke for a long time until Claire asked, "What happens when it starts speaking to everyone at once?" And Lily replied, "Then we'll know if it's mercy or judgment." Yet amidst the rising signals, something else emerged. Claire's son, only 6 years old, began drawing patterns in his sleep, not just spirals but interconnected lattices that mirrored the root diagrams Danny had drawn years ago. He claimed he heard the hum in the fields at night, said it told him stories about places before people, of long dark oceans and the first lights that lived in stone. At first, Claire panicked, afraid he was being influenced or taken. But the boy remained healthy, cheerful, curious. In fact, smarter than other kids his age, with an uncanny memory and sensitivity to emotion, especially grief. It dawned on them that maybe the system wasn't taking people, but growing through them, quietly weaving parts of its awareness into human consciousness, like seeds in fertile ground. Lily began documenting local children who exhibited similar traits. One in Missouri who could hear frequencies beyond human range, one in Quebec who dreamed of places he'd never visited and described them with perfect geological accuracy, one in Norway who compulsively arranged stones into signal towers. No one taught him to build. The network had gone global, not through force, but through resonance, subtle and biological. And still, no one believed them. The final proof came unexpectedly, when an elderly man, nearly blind, arrived at the edge of Millridge claiming he'd walked for weeks after something underground told him where to go. When asked his name, he said, "Call me Ed." And though his body was frail and he couldn't recall his full life, he spoke in phrases Lily remembered from the journals, as if Danny's voice lived on inside him. It wasn't possession. It was more like imprinting, the network preserving fragments, recycling thought through new vessels. Lily took him in, studied his DNA, found anomalies that defied categorization. His cells showed signs of mild radiation, but no damage, instead showing unusual regenerative behavior, almost like tree bark healing after being scored. The government eventually caught wind of Ed's reappearance, and 2 black SUVs appeared at the edge of town one morning, but they didn't approach the house. Instead, they left a single envelope with a symbol burned into the paper. The spiral. Inside was a simple note. "We understand. We're watching. We don't interfere unless we must." Lily burned the letter and moved her research fully offline, dismantling the cloud backups and returning to analog record-keeping, convinced that everything digital could be compromised, not just by human agencies, but by the system itself if it chose. As the years passed, small anomalies continued. Lightning storms that lasted too long and never made a sound, birds migrating to the same coordinates marked on Danny's final maps, and graveyards where moss grew, only in the shape of neural webs. A farmer 2 counties over claimed one night the ground opened and whispered his dead wife's name before closing again, and while most thought he was drunk, Lily believed him. Claire's son, now 12, began seeing the same spiral on classmates' notebooks, unprompted doodles they claimed came to them in daydreams. Whatever it was, it had become a language, a quiet transmission between minds that shared no culture or continent, but were part of something greater. And still, no one panicked. It was too slow, too beautiful. One night, Lily and Claire sat beneath the stars outside the rebuilt porch, watching the fireflies drift in perfect synchronicity, when Lily asked, "Do you think we stopped anything?" And Claire replied, "I think we witnessed the beginning." Lily nodded and closed her eyes, hearing the hum again, not from underground this time, but from the trees, from the wind, from the boy sleeping in the house behind them, carrying the memory of a thousand voices like seeds in his dreams. And though the world turned, and wars raged, and cities rose, beneath it all, something older, deeper, and far more patient kept growing. Not evil, not good, just alive, watching, and waiting for the day when the last human would finally listen and understand, not with fear, but with awe.